probably have to click confirm as well, Radhika. Yeah, great. Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome. We're absolutely delighted to be hosting today's seminar. My name is Aisling Swaine. I am Professor of Gender Studies at the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice at University College Dublin. And today's webinar is taking place as part of our school seminar series and linked to our program on gender studies at the school as well. And I'm the head of subject of gender studies at the school. I'm delighted to be able to host today's webinar. So today I have the pleasure of chairing today's event and discussion, and I have the deepest pleasure to welcome Dr. Radhika Govinda to come and speak with us about her work. And I'll introduce Radhika in just a moment. Just so you know how things are going to go today, we're going to, I'll first introduce Radhika now in a moment. Radhika speak for 5 minutes about her area, and then we'll come back and I'll host a Q&A session. So we have a webinar style event here, so the best way for you all to engage with us is to put in messages in the chat, and I'll be able to moderate those and communicate those across to Radhika, who will also be able then to look at them after you finish speaking, Radhika. So please do share your thoughts with us in the chat room, whether you want to jump in with something urgent you want to say as Radhika is speaking and she can look at that afterwards, or put up some questions so then I can get those ready to help Radhika see those and respond to those once she's finished delivering her presentation. So please feel free to engage with us. We want this to be as collaborative a conversation as we can. I think this issue and this subject is so important for debate and for conversation, and we really welcome, I see a mix of people here from our own school, from students from the school, and international actors in this area as well, and I really welcome you all here, and thanks for coming. So I'm going to get on with introducing Radhika and getting us started on the reason why we're here today. Today's talk is titled Disrupting Coloniality in Feminist Teaching and Learning. And I think there couldn't be a more important issue in the context of pedagogy as well as international relations for all of us to consider here today. And I'm so excited that Radhika's here and given us your time, Radhika, to share your work with us. So thank you for that. I'm going to introduce Radhika and I'll hand over to you then. So Dr. Radhika Govinda is Senior Lecturer in Sociology and the Director of Gender Ed, the University of Edinburgh's Interdisciplinary Hub in Gender and Sexualities Studies. Radhika has an MA from Sciences Po in France and a PhD from the University of Cambridge in the UK. Prior to joining the University of Edinburgh, she held a lectureship in gender studies at Ambedkar University, Delhi in India. Her research and teaching practice focus on the gender politics of development, intersectionality and feminist knowledge production, and she brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to us around this topic. She was the lead and the UK lead on the recently concluded UKRI project, Teaching Feminisms, Transforming Lives, Questions of Identity, Pedagogy and Violence in India and the UK, which was published as an edited collection in 2020. And she's currently working on a monograph, which I think we'll all must read, titled Feminist Politics, Intersectionality and Knowledge Production. I'm really delighted to host Radhika here. She's been involved to some degree with our program, and I think we've just so much to hear and to learn from you about what you found through your research and what we can try and think about and engage with in our own teaching and knowledge production in our school at UCD and beyond that in the world of practice that's related to all of this. So thanks so much, Radhika. I'll hand over to you. When you're ready, you can share your screen and you can start delivering your talk, and anything else you'd like to add about yourself and your background, please feel free to. And I'll turn off my mic and then I'll come back after 25 minutes. And as I said, everybody, please do add in any comments or chat and I'll keep an eye on those as well. So over to you, Radhika.
Thank you so much, Aisling. Can I just confirm that you're able to see my screen?
Perfect, please go ahead. And if you want to explain the context where you are and everything as well, that you're working through PDF, so everybody knows, that's great. Over to you.
Sure. Yeah, so thank you so much, Aisling, for inviting me to speak. And I'm really excited to be connecting from Baroda, which is a city in the western part of India, where I am visiting family. And so there is a chance that that the connection might drop because of where I am. And so instead of sharing a PowerPoint, which is what I'd originally prepared, I've got a PDF, so I'm going to be scrolling down, but there are really slides that I prepared for today's presentation and conversation. But yeah, I'm very, very delighted that you've invited me, Aisling, to speak on a topic that I am very, very passionate about, disrupting coloniality in feminist teaching and learning. What my talk is primarily based on is a paper that I wrote as part of the UGC UK refunded project, which you introduced, Teaching Feminisms, Transforming Lives. This was a 3-year North-South collaboration between the University of Edinburgh, UK, and Ambedkar University, Delhi, India. Simply put, our project was about the successes, challenges, continuities, and disjunctures that feminists encounter in the academy, interrogated and analyzed based on our own experiences and articulated in our own words. It culminated in an edited collection called Doing Feminisms in the Academy in India and the UK, and this was published by Zuban, an imprint of Kali for Women, which is India's first feminist publishing house ever. Interestingly, unfortunately, I should say, the international edition for this has been released by the University of Chicago Press literally this month in April. So hopefully colleagues in the global north will have access to it as well. In this talk, so in today's talk, I'm going to critically examine how white privilege and Northern hegemony in knowledge production play out in contemporary feminist classrooms. What are the pedagogical challenges of engaging with questions of difference in these classrooms? What intersectionality as critical pedagogy has to offer, specifically when it comes to decolonizing these classrooms, how global neoliberal logics affect this process of decolonizing, and finally, what politics of emotions the teachers and the students must navigate in this process. Or you could say that, taking cue from Claire Hemmings, this talk is a reflexive account of the stories I have heard and the stories I tell and how I tell them in feminist classrooms. But before I delve into these stories, a few words about my approach to this paper and my sense of location in the academy. When I first started writing down my reflections for this autoethnographic account, I really struggled to articulate my thoughts. I found it easier to write in verse. So what you'll see on the screen are the verses I wrote before I could articulate my observations in a scholarly manner. This too is a small way in which I'm trying to resist the conventional Western norms of scholarship that have come to dominate the world over. I joined the University of Edinburgh in 2012, and doing so challenged my subjectivity and sense of location in the academy in ways that I hadn't known before. I became acutely aware of how my body was positioned as brown, as South Asian, of color. Like, I didn't even know the term BAME then. It stands for Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic Communities in the UK. As a university student in Paris and later Cambridge, it hadn't mattered so much. Finding solidarity with fellow students from the global South and doing the mental gymnastics of swapping us with them, as frustrating as it was, had been enough. When I say us with them, every time the lecturer said, we in this part of the world, I had to do a translation in my head and swap and say, they in this part of the world, we, my part of the world where I came from in the global South. But, and that had been enough at the time when I was a student, but in my role as a faculty member, often being the only person of color and the only person from the global South at departmental meetings, and in practically all the classes I taught when I first joined the institution, was rather unsettling. But perhaps what was most unsettling was the realization of marginalization when I had mostly known privilege up until then. Although I had known some amount of caste-based discrimination in my childhood in India, and had faced some racial discrimination, I had had a considerably privileged upbringing. And the same social privileges and cultural capital accompanied me when I started my career as a lecturer in gender studies at Ambedkar University, Delhi. I have to admit, being the only woman academic of color from the Global South in the classrooms in which I taught at Edinburgh, has had a profound impact on me. It has changed the vantage point from which I teach. It has transformed the way I see knowledge. It has led me to an appreciation of the need to decolonize what counts as knowledge. Among other things, I understand decolonizing or disrupting coloniality as being about the politics of location, including my own. It has led me to confront dilemmas about my own subjectivity, about inserting myself into the classroom space, about including myself in the discourse. As one of the few, if not the only obvious visible others, because there are many who may not necessarily be visible in their otherness, in my own classroom, decolonizing the classroom space is then not an option for me. I see it as a requirement. I want to begin by sharing with you a story about the history of feminism to highlight the need for disrupting coloniality in feminist teaching and learning. The waves metaphor, as many of you would know, has remained the model of choice for teaching the history of feminism in women's and gender studies courses in both the global north as well as the global south. Whilst the metaphor helps to shed light on some very important feminist struggles, an intersectional lens reveals that this approach is nonetheless exclusionary. It has mostly enabled middle-class, white, Western women's political agendas to stand in for feminism more generally. To be fair, the waves metaphor is employed in feminist classrooms today with theoretical critiques by Black and post-colonial feminists added on. But what this implies is that feminism is always already constructed as Euro-American and predominantly white in origin and development. In my experience, this pedagogical strategy informs in broadly two ways the students' perceptions at the level of the classroom. The more politically conscious students see the strategy for what it is and often observe in the course evaluations that even though the content about women of color and third world women was added on reasonably early on in the course, it failed to get adequately stirred. But I suspect that for the majority of the students, they continue to receive the add and stir model as communicating the contours and particularities of the knowledge field, and that the model ends up informing student expectations and epistemological outlooks regarding what constitutes as core and what constitutes as marginal knowledge. It likely signals to the students as to who deserves to be a part of feminism, what constitutes feminist knowledge, and as a result, it might contribute to what Spivak has denounced as epistemic violence. I recall teaching the history of feminism using the waves metaphor back in Delhi, later seeing it being used in Edinburgh and feeling deeply dissatisfied by it. For my students in Delhi, the intellectual distance they needed to travel to access and relate to this metaphor had been far greater than for my students at Edinburgh. Some years ago, I came across Heidi Mirza's 2009 piece in which she narrated how excited she had been at having stumbled upon a photograph at the Museum of London of Indian women participating in a rally organized by the British suffragettes. Like her, I too had never known that women like us had been part of the suffragette movement. I imagined how much more relatable the waves metaphor would have been for my students in Delhi had I been able to narrate them the story about Indian women's participation in a movement that had been largely written and recounted as a white women's movement. However, the story is much more complicated, as it turns out. Sumita Mukherjee notes in her 2017 blog and later in her 2018 book how these Indian women had been co-opted by imperial feminists. They had been there at the march to demand neither their own right to vote in Britain nor the right to vote in India, but to represent the size, the enormity of the British Empire. To commemorate 100 years of women's right to vote in the UK, the Royal Mail released in 2018 a stamp of Indian suffragette Sophia Dalip Singh's picture on it. This is not to say that there weren't Indian women demanding their own right to vote back in India. They were very much there, and they were also connected with the suffragette movements in other parts of the world. But we rarely hear of them. And when we do, there seems to be a colonial twist to the narrative. The second story that I want to share with you has to do with the production and circulation of knowledge in gender and development as a pedagogical site. The breadth of scholarship now available about gender politics in the global south and the critiques by postmodern Black and post-colonial feminists have meant that there is no doubt a strong awareness that teaching about third world women in singular, homogeneous, disempowered terms is problematic. There's definitely a recognition of that. You're likely to find Chanda Talpade Mohanty's Under Western Eyes as a prescribed reading on practically every gender and development course you encounter in the UK. That I can vouch for. However, these courses continue to mirror the field's ongoing inability to train the developmental gaze anywhere else but southward. Equally, they may mirror the field's problematic relationship with neoliberalism. What do I mean by this? Let me explain. In fact, I should clarify that this second story I want to share with you is less a story and more an interrogation of a teaching aid in telling the stories we tell in gender and development. Back in the 1990s, the use of case studies was being advocated to promote an appreciation for the diversity of Southern women. Today, they have become a mainstay in the pedagogical toolkit of gender and development teachers, and the Southern women of these case studies have an assured, almost prepackaged presence in the classroom. Let me clarify, I don't take issue with the use of case studies as a pedagogical tool as such. I use them myself. But I do fear whether they perpetuate among our students, even if inadvertently, this understanding of development as a problem of underdevelopment housed in the global south. They may also uncritically reflect the increasing shift to project-driven approaches where women are being empowered to solve their own problems, making these problems and solutions apparently more accessible for classroom analysis. The way they are framed also perpetuates the notion of societies in the global south adhering strictly to the gender binary and heteronormativity, whereas many would say that both of these were originally colonial imports. Such framing of case studies and representation of women and societies in the global south therein problematically signals to the students the need for the world's gender experts to come from the global north. Typically, I would like to argue that until Northern gender and development academics turn their gaze at themselves, until gender and development also becomes about understanding the developmental challenges in their own backyard, until post-colonial feminist insiders, outsiders like myself, challenge the structures of hegemony from our own marginal yet privileged locations. After all, we benefit from the privileges of being in the northern part of the globe as far as when it comes to the academy. So until we begin to cast the lens and the gaze at ourselves in our teaching practice, we will not be able to truly empower our students with the comparative and decolonial lenses required to bridge the chasm between us and them, and to see the third world women as anything other than worlds apart from what is known and familiar to most of our students in the global north. An important issue to guard against in this regard is turning our own students from the global south into case studies. What do I mean by this? A question I ask myself when teaching gender and development is whether my students from African countries, from Asian countries, from Latin American countries, and at the postgraduate level, there are at least a handful of these majority world contexts that students come from each year, whether these students, especially those who are people of color, whether they feel included in my classroom. How can I teach in a manner that is self-affirmatory for them and others like them who may be visibly different from the white Western majority in my class? How do I invite those students of mine who are from these Southern contexts to share their insights on these contexts without putting them in a spot or turning them into a case study? Having been asked to explain the caste system in India in practically every class that I attended as a graduate student in Paris, I'm all too aware of what it feels like to be treated as a case study. Well, so it's important to teach in a manner that recognizes difference. It is equally important not to exceptionalize it. I know I can't do this work alone. I need my students, and here I look to my white Western students to become my allies, to the students who are in my classroom to become my allies. I tell them early on that we need to together co-construct an inclusive classroom. I want to now share with you my reflections on actualizing intersectionality as critical pedagogy to address some of the issues that I've outlined so far with the stories we tell in our classrooms and how we tell them. I'm mindful of how intersectionality has become a buzzword, that it has been co-opted and depoliticized by the neoliberal regime in higher education. However, in its original radical form, intersectionality was conceived as a mechanism for understanding that gender does not exist in isolation from race, caste, class, religion, and ability, among others. That these identities are multiple and intersecting, and therefore the resultant power and privilege and inequalities and exclusion too cannot be understood and addressed through single axis frameworks. Intersectional pedagogy takes cognizance of this in terms of both the planned and the transacted curriculum. I learned early on in my experience of teaching at Edinburgh that if I wanted my students to truly engage and understand to understand and engage with the intersectionality of identities and structures and how these produce marginality and oppression without thinking that these things happen only out there in the global South, then I could not actually begin there. I would need to begin here and now by getting us to reflect on our intersectional privilege, theirs and mine. One of the ways in which I try to do this is to conduct a privilege walk. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of this. The slide on the screen should give you some idea about this activity. I'm afraid I don't have time to get into the details just now, but I'd be happy to elaborate on it in the Q&A. But now let it suffice for me to say that this activity acts as an important first step in what Spivak and Davis refer as the uncoercive rearrangement of the learning desires of the classroom. It signals to the students that reflexivity is important in our classroom, that it is, in fact, an important step in the decolonizing project too. Centering the voices, perspectives, people's movements, and scholarship from the majority world, as Avino Okesh reminds us, is yet another step in decolonizing the feminist classroom. This cannot be done merely by adding non-Eurocentric scholars to the reading list. Enabling our students to relate to the stories from the majority world matters. You see, our students are often surprised and uncomfortable when the woman in the mirror of course materials does not duplicate their own identity formations, and instead other women seem to be in charge. I argue that this is perhaps because most of our students know only to read what is addressed to them. So when the course material pushes the students towards a decentering of their subjectivity, they must be helped to recognize how their self cannot be known solely on its own terms, that it is in fact always already entangled with the other. Let me give you an example of how I try to do this on an advanced undergraduate course called Gender Marginality and Social Change. After a session on questions of race, caste, and ethnocentrism, I asked the students to imagine and write up the conversation that Black feminist scholar activist Bell Hooks and Dalit feminist scholar activist Annie Namala might have if they were to meet. In this exercise, the mirror of the course material that students must draw on emits a gaze of otherness, looking back, so to speak, in ways that alter the schemes of recognition. The students are being asked to authoritatively write up a conversation that is meant to look at them specifically as racialized identities in a manner that challenges their own self-perception. I enable them to reassemble their identity as purveyors of knowledge, albeit not in the traditional sense, but by indicating to them that they are the moderators of this conversation, that they are the authors of this imagined conversation. They can inscribe themselves into the conversation in the way that they please. They can ask of Hooks and Namala whatever questions they like and decide on howsoever these scholar activists might respond. Of course, grounding this in the scholarship and talks that these scholar activists have given before. This also features as a short essay option on the course. Now, the assessment is a big thing, you'll agree. Even if only half a dozen students attempt this question, the fact that this is an essay option signals to the entire class that this learning is valued, that it is considered worthy of being tested. Employing intersectionality as critical pedagogy in this way is not without its emotional challenges. This brings me to the reflection that even as I hold on to the ground rules of confidentiality, respect, listening to others, listening to each other, expressing our thoughts and feelings freely but constructively, I find myself less and less convinced by the foundational feminist practice of creating safe classrooms that these rules have their roots in, if you like. The safe classroom is one where no one is supposed to feel threatened. Over the years, I have found myself moving away from this towards the contested classroom, or what some have called the transformative classroom. My understanding of such a classroom is one which recognizes that we do not leave our embodied identities, our embodied intersectionalities at the door of the classroom. The social norms, structures, and processes that differentially confer power and privilege upon individuals outside of the classroom very much operate within it as well. Our classroom is, in this sense, not intended as a safe space and is certainly not a community of equals. It is instead a space of discomfort and hopefully transformation in which students and I recognize and begin to unlearn our privilege and examine how this and our relative marginality are embedded in unequal structures of coloniality. Let me move on and perhaps say a few words by way of conclusion now. And what I want to say is that as a feminist academic of color from the Global South, I have been thinking about these concerns for some years now, but just because I'm brown or from the majority world does not mean that I'm disembedded from the colonial enterprise. I too am a product of a system of knowledge that is predominantly Western. So I try to think of decolonizing classrooms and democratizing the curriculum as a journey rather than a destination. This is not something that I'm alone in thinking and saying. I think of it as a process, not an outcome. And there are several blind spots, several dilemmas that I still need to interrogate, others that I'm in the process of addressing. But doing this work can be quite exhausting, to be frank. And often it can be borne by, it's often borne by the invisible labor of women of color, of staff from the Global South in the neoliberal university. And this leads me to argue that our labor towards disrupting coloniality in feminist teaching and learning must be recognized, and decolonial praxis must be embraced and supported by my white feminist colleagues and the institution itself. The onus has to be on all involved. Only then will the project of decentering whiteness and disrupting Northern hegemony in knowledge production can become scalable. Thank you. Over to you, Aisling.
Thank you, Radhika. I wonder, could you stop sharing screen and we'll come back on full when you're ready?
Absolutely.
Radhika, thank you. I'm sitting here trying to absorb all of the richness of what you've shared, and I have so many thoughts and things to say, but I'm going to hold off for a moment and invite anyone who's with us here today. If you'd like to come in, there's a Q&A box if you'd like to share some thoughts and questions, or if you'd like to come on mic, you can raise your hand. As far as I know, it works that way, so hopefully it will. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop recording for the moment,